what I want to do in today's lecture is to shift gears somewhat from what we've been talking about in the first unit of the course. As you know, the first unit of the course was focused on a set of texts that were concerned with what is involved in human flourishing. And though our opening text, Glaucon's Challenge from Plato's Republic, concerned itself with morality and the way in which morality contributes to human flourishing, we haven't, up until this point, given much attention to what philosophers have had to say about the nature of morality. And so the goal in this unit is, in an incredibly accelerated fashion, to introduce you today and next Tuesday to two of the most prominent moral theories in the Western tradition, and then in the remaining sessions before March break, to talk to you about some of the empirical research about these questions. And I know we have a wide range of backgrounds in this class. Some of you are now taking your first philosophy course. Some of you have taken an entire course on ethics. And so I've tried to pitch the lecture in such a way that it brings everybody up to speed, but that it does so in a way that I hope won't bore those of you who have encountered this before. In particular, to make up for the fact that there's very little empirical psychology in this lecture, I have 6 polling slides. So those will come in the middle of the lecture, right when all of you are zoning out because you got 2 hours of sleep last night. So even if you don't pay attention for the first part, you'll get to vote in the middle. All right, so what is it that moral philosophy sets out to do? What is it to provide a philosophical account of morality? What moral philosophy is the systematic endeavor to understand moral concepts and to justify moral principles and theories. That is, moral philosophy, even if it ends up giving a non-systematic answer to how it is that morality works and what it is that morality does so within the endeavor of thinking systematically about the nature of morality. What do I mean by morality? I mean that moral theories aim to provide accounts of terms like right and wrong, permissible and impermissible, ought and ought not, forbidden, good, bad, and the like, and to provide an account of the behaviors to which those terms apply. It is fundamentally, to remind you of a terminological distinction that we've made before, a normative as opposed to a descriptive enterprise. Philosophical moral theory doesn't aim to tell us how people act. It aims to tell us how people ought to act if they wish to conform to the constraints that morality places on them. In particular, moral philosophy is concerned with providing a principled answer to 3 kinds of questions. The first kind of question we encountered already in the context of Glaucon's challenge. It's the question of moral motivation. Why should we want to act in keeping with what morality demands of us? And in a minute, I'll give you a sense of the range of answers that have been provided to that question. So the first question that moral philosophy asks is, why would we even want to be moral? It then asks the particular question, what should we do insofar as we seek to act morally? And about that, we've had very little to say so far. We know that, according to Aristotle, to be brave, one acts as the brave one does. But Aristotle just put forth bravery as a virtue without any explanation of what it was that made bravery fall into the category of virtues and cowardice fall into the category of vices, other than the very general analysis of the mean. And we haven't looked at any specific claims about particular actions being morally acceptable or not. So the second sort of thing that a moral theory tries to do, and again, I'll give some examples in a minute, is give us specific answers to the question, is this act morally okay? In addition, what a moral theory aims to do is to tell us why we gave the answers that we did in question 2. In virtue of what common feature are the acts that fall into the category of moral to be distinguished from the acts that fall into the category of immoral? So what do answers to these 3 questions look like? Let's start, since we've encountered it already, with the question of moral motivation. So one category of answers that one might give to why it is that we would be moral, act in keeping with the constraints of morality, is a self-interest account. So one might give an account which says, when you behave morally, things run smoothly. As Socrates argues in response to Glaucon, when you behave in keeping with the constraints of morality, there is harmony in your soul, and that provides you with the possibility of a certain kind of flourishing. Or you might have what's implicit in the very first argument that Glaucon gives, a view that morality provides a certain kind of stability in society. Each of us behaving in pro-social ways increases the likelihood of others around us behaving in pro-social ways. And so we reach a kind of equilibrium state whereby things run smoothly if everybody behaves pro-socially. And we'll talk about that again at the beginning of the political philosophy section. So one kind of self-interest theory is a theory that appeals to a certain kind of coordination, either a coordination among the parts of the soul or a coordination across individuals in a society. A second kind of self-interest theory is what we might call a get-good-stuff theory. So this lies at the heart of some religious traditions. Here's what you get if you act in keeping with the constraints of morality. You get eternal life in a really nice place. Here's what you get if you don't act in keeping with the constraints of morality. You get eternal continuation in a really unpleasant place. So the notion that there is some reward beyond earth for behaving in moral ways is an example of a self-interested justification of morality. Or one might give the sort of justification that Adeimantus gives in response to Glaucon's challenge. Adeimantus points out that one of the things morality provides you with is enhanced reputation. So as a result of behaving in keeping with the standards of morality, you come to be perceived as having behaved in that way, and that reputation brings to you some value. Or it might be, as Aristotle discusses at the end of Book 10, that society is structured in some way that motivates people to act in keeping with the constraints of morality because doing so is a way of avoiding punishment. Many of us obey speeding laws for precisely that reason. We obey them most especially when there are flashing lights in our vicinity. But we can have an internalized version of the reduction of punishment as well. Part of the Freudian picture that we heard about in the Divided Soul lecture discussed the development of conscience as an internalization of external rules, whereby the superego gets upset when the id behaves in ways that aren't in keeping with the constraints of morality. And one can have a non-Freudian version of that as well that appeals to the notion of conscience. So the idea that what morality brings you is either the possibility of salvation or enhanced reputation, or the possibility of not being punished by external laws, or the possibility of not being punished by one's conscience, is another version of a self-interest theory. So that's one kind of justification one might provide for behaving in moral ways. A second, very different kind of justification says the reason we act morally is because normative features are fundamental features of the world. There's a brute ought out there. It's a fact about reality that what we are morally obliged to do is to act in whatever ways it is that morality demands, and not out of self-interest, but simply because we are responsive to that feature of the world, we are motivated to act morally. kind of justification, third kind of explanation of moral motivation is what we might call a factive theory that says roughly, this is just the way people are. So evolutionary accounts that say we've been selected, pro-social behaviors have been selected for, perhaps because they enable the resolution of coordination problems, but whatever the explanation, pro-social behaviors, says this theory, have been selected for. So it's a brute fact about the world that we behave in pro-social ways, not a brute normative fact about the world, just a brute descriptive fact about the world that we behave in that way. Or you might have not an evolutionary-based version of this, but a version that says, look, this is just the way the human soul expresses itself when it conforms to its natural state. So you might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is out of self-interest. You might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is because of altruism. You might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is just that's the way we do behave. Or you might have some sort of combination theory. And we've talked already about the first of these, the self-interest theory. And as this section of the course goes on, we'll talk more about some of the other sorts of explanation. So those are some examples of the kinds of answers that are given to the first question, the question of moral motivation.
I'm just recapping this.
Issues arise when we think about the question of moral behavior?
You
saw a number of examples of this in the reading that we did for today.
And she started
One kind of question that moral theories set out to provide answers
If you need my notes, links are in the description.
Either morally
Notes
required or morally
have a lot of
to harm one
things
person
I've
in order
found
to
around the
help
web.
many others. So Bernard Williams' story of Jim and the Indians.
Things I've found around the web, PDFs, books that are public domain. Link in the description to my notes. It's all there.
The Omelas story, where we're told the story of a society whose flourishing depends upon the suffering of a single child. Or the trolley cases that I presented you with
Let that
in
kid
the
die.
very first lecture,
Let him cry, sorry.
where a
Let him
trolley
cry.
is headed down a track towards 5 people, and we're in a position to deflect the trolley in some way so that one ends up being killed instead.
No.
Those are examples of schematic representations of the kinds of questions that moral theory confronts all the time. Whenever we think about deferrals of threat, is it right to quarantine a population suffering from a particular illness in a way that will cause harm to them but benefit the rest of society? We are thinking about these sorts of questions. So one sort of question that moral philosophy aims to answer is the question of whether this sort of trade-off is morally required or morally permitted. A particularly profound version of that question comes out when we think about what our moral duties are to those who are less fortunate. So the philosopher Peter Singer has famously argued that the entire structure of the first world and the third world is a morally illegitimate one because it involves an unwillingness on the part of those in the first world to do what is morally demanded of them, namely to take a large proportion of their resources and redistribute those to people who are suffering from extraordinarily easily curable illnesses. People who don't have mosquito nets, people who don't have vaccinations, people who don't have clean water, people who don't have access to basic medical care in the first 5 years that would, for example, prevent lifelong blindness. So another question that moral theory asks, in some ways a version of the earlier question, is in general what our duties are to those who are less fortunate. It also asks questions like this. Are these sorts of behaviors morally mandatory? Is it morally mandatory for us to behave in ways that help the environment, say by recycling? Is it morally mandatory for us to act in certain ways towards non-human animals, perhaps by being vegetarian? Is it morally required of us to worship a deity in some way? Is religious worship something that's morally mandatory? Is something like respect for elders a fundamental part of traditional moral frameworks? No. And moral theories also ask questions like, are these kinds of things morally permissible? Is abortion morally permissible? Is euthanasia morally permissible? Is capital punishment morally permissible? How about sex before marriage? How about lying for one or another motivation? How about,
enforcement of morality morally permissible?
Failing to cultivate one's talents, which Kant thinks is a violation of moral mandates. So these are the kinds of questions that moral theories aim to provide answers to. And it might seem like a heterogeneous bunch, but it gives you a sense of the generality of explanation that moral theories seek to provide. So let's turn to 4 major moral theories in the Western tradition and think about how it is that they could simply categorically provide answers to this wide range of questions. So the kind of moral theory that we're going to discuss in today's lecture primarily is a moral theory known as utilitarianism. It tells us an act is moral insofar as it produces the greatest good for the greatest number. It takes as its fundamental notion the notion of good, and it gives us answers to the questions that we've previously asked ourselves, as long as we know how goods are distributed in response to them. So if we know what it is that produces happiness in sentient beings, then utilitarianism will give us an answer to the question of whether being vegetarian is morally mandated. It'll tell us to take the amount of happiness that's distributed across sentient beings and look at which distribution is going to maximize the amount of happiness.
True.
So utilitarianism gives us one sort of systematic answer to this question. A second sort of answer to this question, which we'll discuss in lecture on Tuesday, is the answer given by Kant and the deontological tradition. What Kant says is that an act is moral insofar as it's performed as the result of acting with the correct sort of motivation. It takes as its primary notion not the notion of goodness, but rather the notion of
they are like
rightness.
Consequences
and
of
on that basis,
the
Kant
only
is going
thing
to
that
give a
matters.
bunch of answers to our specific questions. In particular, he's going to argue that it's not okay to sacrifice the good of the one for the good of the many. And he's going to argue that lying is morally unacceptable. And we'll talk next class about how, from a very abstract principle like this one can derive these sorts of particular answers. We've already looked at the ancient traditional answer to this in Aristotle, that an act is moral insofar as it's performed as the result of having a virtuous character. And so what Aristotle says to us is look and see how the well-raised one would behave. And once you see what it is that the virtuous one does, you can learn through his or her example what it is that morality demands of us.
Literal
And a final
divine
tradition
virtue.
about which we won't have much to say in this lecture is, of course, a basis for morality which has stood at the center of Western culture for at least 2,000 years, which is the idea that an act is moral insofar as it conforms to what the divinity demands of us.
She misspoke.
So one
Just like
can
me.
provide an explanation, as utilitarian does, that makes appeal to the notion of goodness. One can provide a justification that makes appeal, as deontology does, to the notion of rightness. One can provide a justification that makes appeal, as virtue ethics does, to the notion of virtuousness. Or one can provide an account that makes appeal, as religious ethics does, to the notion of divine mandate.
Nice.
So let's think a little more about the relation among these 3 particular theories, the ones on which we're going to focus in the context of this class, as a way of coming to understand the particular theory that we're thinking about today, namely utilitarianism.
Let's go.
So virtue ethics focuses its attention on the actor. Not the person who stands up on the stage and recites lines from Hamlet, but rather the actor who performs an act that will be moral
It's very
or not.
self-improvement style.
Deontology focuses its attention
theory.
on the act. It looks not at who's doing it, but rather at what act is done and under what description. Consequentialism, by contrast, looks not at who does the act, and looks not at the description under which the act is done, but looks rather at the consequences that the act brings about. And we've encountered virtue theory in the voice of, see if you recognize this gentleman, in the voice of Aristotle. We will encounter deontology in the voice of Immanuel Kant. And what we're going to discuss today is consequentialism and in particular utilitarianism in the voice of John Stuart Mill. So let's look now at what it is that Mill has to say about the fundamental nature of morality. So what Mill contends, and let me say we're coming up on the clicker slide, so if you're zoning out, it's time to pull out your clicker, and in about 4 or 5 minutes we'll be doing some polls. So Mill contends that the right kind of framework for thinking about moral theories is a consequentialist framework. So not one that looks at the actor as virtue theory does, not one that looks at the act as deontology does, but rather one that looks at the consequences in the way that consequentialism does. The degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, and Mill provides a particular version of this. He says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by a particular kind of consequence, namely the utility that the act produces. So you might have a consequentialist theory that says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, namely, for example, the amount of bananas that it produces. It would be an odd moral theory, but it would be a consequentialist theory that says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, in particular by its degree of banana production. So that would be a very general kind of consequentialist theory. Utilitarian theories are a particular kind of consequentialist theory that says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, in particular by the amount of utility. Usefulness, happiness in Mill's account of what kind of utility we're concerned with, by the amount of utility that it produces. That means, to remind you of the handouts that you got in section this week, that to be utilitarian is a sufficient condition to be a consequentialist, but not a necessary one. And to be a consequentialist is a necessary condition on being a utilitarian, but not a sufficient one. And if what I just said isn't completely obvious to you, take a look at the second side of the handout that you got in section this week. So Mill not only makes a utilitarian commitment, he actually, in the course of making that commitment, makes two very particular claims that I now want to ask you to think about in light of some particular cases. The first is the famous formulation of the greatest happiness principle, which in your text appears right at the beginning on page 77 in the reprint. Mill says, famously, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. And he continues a few pages later to clarify that what he means is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. And in a minute, we'll think through what that implies. The second commitment of Mill's that I want you to think about is one that runs straight on in opposition to what we talked about in Aristotle last week. Mill says, the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action. He who saves another creature from drowning does what is morally right, whether his motive be from due happiness or molecular second being a condition to be a consequentialist, but not second side of the handout that you got in section this week. So Mill not only makes a utilitarian commitment, he actually, in the course of making that commitment, makes two very particular claims that I now want to ask you to think about in light of some particular cases. The first is the famous formulation of the greatest happiness principle, which in your text appears right at the beginning on proportion as and he continues, but that implied is one that runs about in Aristotle with the morality of the act, but is morally right, paid for his trouble. The motivation for the hope of being paid for his trouble. The motivation in some way different, but as Mill asks you, take the case that Mill's described. You see somebody drowning in a lake, and the question is this:
now we get to the fun part.
Is your act of saving that person morally right, morally virtuous, moral, only if it's done out of duty? I want to save that person because it's the right thing to do, or some other sort of pro-social motive. If you think that, push 1. Or is the act morally right regardless of its motive, even if you do it because there's a big sign up on the trees that say, save a drowning person, $10,000 reward. And so you think, $10,000, that's good money. And in you jump into the water.
Nice.
All right, I'll push the 10-second timer. We have roughly 50 of you, 70 of you. Good numbers are
You do not want to keep saving drowning people.
This room is filled with Kantians or filled with consequentialists. So interestingly, there's a pretty close to even split. Most of you seem to side with Mill on the question that an act is morally right regardless of the motive. But a sizable portion of you are going to be pleased when we read Kant, who gives the answer that you offer. And one of the things that we want to do in section next week is to have those of you who fall on one or the other side of this question talk through with others around you why it is that you either fell into this group or you fell into this one. So far, Mill's doing pretty well. He has a slight majority of you on his side. I now want to present you with a series of cases to ask what you think about the greatest happiness principle. Remember, Mill says that an act is moral insofar as it produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number, where we're not concerned with how that happiness is distributed across individuals. So let's start with a following case. There's an act which you can perform which will give you
with how it's distributed?
100 units of happiness.
Motive doesn't matter.
Smiley faces, aren't you all feeling pro-social in their light? Each of those smiley faces represents 10 units of happiness. So suppose you have a fan, it's a very hot day, and you have a fan.
So, motive doesn't matter. The morality of actions committed don't matter. Motive doesn't matter. Morality of actions don't matter. Okay. Only the consequence do not. Morality of action. Motive doesn't matter. Morality of actions doesn't matter. Only the moral utility of consequences do. Okay.
fan that blows upon you, and the coolness of that fan just provides you with 100 units of happiness. Or suppose you have some delicious cookies, and eating those cookies provides you with 100 units of happiness. In addition, performing that act provides 100 other people with 1 unit of happiness each. Suppose your fan blows a little bit outside of your room so that in addition to cooling you off 100 units, it cools the people in the next room off 1 unit apiece. Or suppose that when you finish eating your 100 cookies, there are 100 cookies left over, and each of 100 people gets to have 1 cookie, and it brings them 1 unit of happiness. Okay, so that's Act 1. It has a total of 200 units of happiness. You get 100 units, and each of 100 other people get 1 unit. So your choice is between performing that act and performing an act which I'm going to call Act 2, which has exactly the same effects for you, right? It brings you 100 units of happiness. So here you are with your 100 units of happiness. But in this case, if you made a slight change in the angle of your fan, for example, you would be just as cool as you were in the first case, but it would double the amount of happiness of the people on the outside, right? You angle this fan slightly differently, and instead of being cooled 1 unit, the people are cooled 2 units. Or unit of happiness, you leave the extra cookies around so that everybody else gets 2 units of happiness. In this case, by performing an act which has no different consequences for you as far as happiness is concerned, you double the happiness of 100 other people with respect to the.
So in this case, I get to give like, I eat all the cookies, give 100 people cookie crisps. Here, I eat all the cookies and give 200 people cookie crisps. Sorry, cookie dust, cookie crisp. What is it? Cookie crumb? Cookie crumb, yes. Crumb is like, no. Yeah, crumb.
So the question is simply this. Given the choice between Act 1, which brings a total of 200 units of happiness, 100 units for you, and 1 unit for each of 100 other people, or Act 2, which brings the same amount of happiness to you, but 200 units of happiness to others, and hence a total of 300, do you think, push 1 if you think only Act 1 is moral, that is, only the one where you get 100 units and everybody else gets 1, push 2 if you think only Act 2 is moral, the one where you redirect your fan slightly or whatever it is that you do to double the happiness of those around you, or 3, that either one of those is a moral act. Okay, and I'm going to turn
either one is moral.
So what
kind of a question is this?
How it is that your first take on Mill's greatest happiness principle goes, and let's see how the numbers
either
come.
one matters. Yeah, either one is
so very few of you think
God.
that the moral act is the one whereby you get 100 units of happiness
Who are
and
the
100
ones
others get 1 unit.
in black?
But you're roughly equally divided on the question of whether morality mandates
the
that you
2% are
redistribute your resources in such a way that they go also to others. So most of our discussion in the remaining slides will be concerned with when this 44% moves over to another place. But I'll be interested to see how all of this plays out. Okay, so that was our first case, the case where at no cost to yourself, you can bring happiness to others. Let's now contrast exactly the same first case. You get 100 units of happiness, 100 others get 1 unit each, so there's a total of 200 units. With a second case, we'll call this Act 3, where in order to redirect the goods, you bring your own happiness down to 50 units. So in order to redirect your fan in such a way that the other people get 2 units each, you have a slight reduction in the amount of utility for you, but it's still the case that this is more beneficial overall. So Act 1, you get a case that have a where there's a total of 200 units. With a second case, we'll call this Act 3, where in order to
so we are discounting
the goods,
Act 2
you bring your own happiness down to 50 units. So in order to redirect your fan in such a way that the other people get 2 units each, you have a slight reduction in the amount of utility for you, but it's still the case that this is more beneficial overall. So Act 1, you get 100 units of happiness, other people get 1. Act 2, you've reduced your happiness, you've redirected the fan, you're eating fewer of the cookies, but you've distributed it in such a way that others get their 2 units. Okay, so the question is, only Act 1, where you get 100 units and everybody else gets 1?
I see. Okay, now this is interesting. Others get 200 units. Okay, 2 units. I'm gonna bite the bullet. Either one is more. Fuck. Fuck the gatekeepers. Either one is more.
Only Act 2, where you get 50 units and everybody else gets 2, but the total is higher, or either one. And again, we'll open polling with a 10-second timer, and let's see how the numbers go.
I'm gonna mold so many people are going to choose Act 3.
All right. So a
Oh,
little bit
thank
of
God.
change over to either act being moral.
Thank
More
God.
of you think
They're not-
that it is
they're not
morally
that stupid.
required to increase the
They're
happiness
getting
of
less
those around
stupid.
you when there's
They're
no
getting
harm to
less stupid.
yourself
Thank
than
you.
you think is required
2% are
when
still
there
trolling.
is some cost to yourself. Notice that Mill is very clear that what is morally required is number 2 here. That only
Yeah.
the act which brings the greater amount
Mill
of
is dead.
utility to the community as a whole is morally required. Let's turn to a third case. The first version is the same as before. You get 100 units, everybody else gets 1. Now, in order to do the good for others, you have to experience some kind of disutility. You turn your fan totally away from yourself, but the result of that is that 100 others get 3 units each. So now the question is this: is the act that is morally permitted of you, or is the act that is a moral act, the one that we've initially presented, the one where you have some disutility but other people get utility, or are these of equal value? Notice the total of 200 units, 250 units. So the first case, our classic case. The second case, one where you experience some discomfort, but in exchange for that discomfort, other people, not you, experience some good. Okay, let's turn on the 10-second timer.
Okay. This one is an actual problem. Okay. 100 units, everybody gets 1 unit. There are a total of 200 units. You get discounted 50 units of happiness. You're less happy. You can distribute 3 units of happiness to everyone else. So the total amount of happiness that has been, unloaded or whatever, sprinkled upon the world is like 250 units. So the question is, only Act 1 is moral, Act 2 is moral, either one is moral. So unless this minus 50 units, impacts future, makes you unalive yourself, or impacts future ability to make future decisions like this, to distribute happiness, like you did, like you are the agent, correct? So if you cannot distribute happiness in the future, then what's the point of insisting on Act 2? So yeah, either one is moral. I'm gonna bite the bullet again.
And see
Hit
how
me.
this comes out.
Hit me. Hit me.
Okay, so in this case, it
People
appears
are
that
getting
very few of you
smarter.
are siding with Mill. A certain number of you are here
The
saying that
ratios
what
are
we need
getting
to
better.
do is
Sorry.
to provide the greatest good for the greatest number.
Nice.
And a sizable percentage of you is growing to think that perhaps morality doesn't demand any sacrifices of you. Let's go on. Next case, exactly like the last one, except it's somebody else who has 50 units of disutility in order to distribute 3 units of utility to others. So here's the case. Either you get 100 units of happiness and others get 1 unit each for a total of 200 units, or let's assume you preserve your 100 units of happiness here. We're leaving you out of the equation. And the question is this: suppose you are
Somebody
distributing
is less happy.
resources for society as a whole. There's a case where, actually this Act 1 ought to also be someone else. So the case where someone else gets 100 units of happiness and 100 others get 1 unit each. Or a case where somebody else loses 50 units of happiness, but 100 others get 3 units each. Okay, so
Either
let's
one
replace
is
this
moral.
you in Act 1 with someone else.
Either one is
and
moral.
ask the
Sue me.
question of whether
Sue
a
me.
distribution of resources across society, which produces
What are they going
200
to say?
units of good in this form,
these
or
are the same
distribution of resources
questions.
across society which produces 250 units of good in this form, minor 50 units
There's
of
not
suffering by
much
one
difference.
for 300 units of benefits by another. Which one of those
Get
do you
monster,
take to be
monster energy.
what
It's
morality
much-
demands? And
It's getting
5,
expensive.
4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see if
3.
there's any change from the previous case. Okay, all of a sudden, here, we get a radical shifting of...
Who chose that? Who chose that? Bro, Yale students are morons.
the graphs. Almost 50% of you are clear
They're just
that
teenagers.
the
Of
act
course
that
they
requires
chose.
bringing
They're
suffering
just
to one
getting into
person,
philosophy.
a reduction of
Let's
utility,
chill.
is
Let's
not
chill.
morally mandated. Later in the section that we are encountering in the class right now, we will consider the question of whether there's actually a fixed matter of where the baseline is. and whether in fact this radical shift that we get when we move from increasing utility to decreasing utility in
These
people's
people are
psychology
so
about what
concerned with
morality demands
optics.
is in fact picking up
Why,
on
why only Act 1 is moral? How does that make sense? Because you discounted someone else from 50 units. These people are pussies. Optics Andes, you.
an artificial difference. Let's move to our final case. So our final case is one where either someone gets 100 units of happiness and 100 others get 1 unit each, so there's 200 units of happiness.
Nice. Okay.
Or a case, where someone gets 5,000 units of happiness taken away, but 100 other people get 5 units each, so that there are 45,000 units of happiness produced by the performance of Act 6. So the case here is either a place where nobody has anything bad going on,
Let
but the total
that
units of
guy
happiness are only 200,
suffer.
or one person has a lot of
This
suffering
is
going on,
not even.
but the total units of happiness are 45,000. Okay, and let's put the poll on with our 10, 9,
Let
8, 7,
them
6 seconds.
suffer.
We'll see how it is that you come out
Either one
on
is moral.
this question.
Screw this.
All right. On this question,
Pussies.
which I know already from
All
my
of them
interviewing
pussies.
responses to the Omelas case on which this is modeled, it seems clear to a lot of you that the suffering of one is not something that morality demands of us, even if the result is an increase in general utility.
Okay.
Now, as you know,
So they are also in. I didn't think they are. They are. They are factoring in negatives. I thought it was only neutral and positives. Of course, they're saying minus, so it's negatives. Sorry, I'm autistic, I guess.
the Omelas story tells the story of a
Okay.
society where
Let's go.
there is a community of people, each of whom has thousands and thousands of units of utility. They're incredibly
Nice.
happy in how they live.
Okay.
But that society exists as it does only because there is a child locked away whose suffering permits the society's joy.
So
And as you
good.
know in the story, when children reach adulthood,
Just one
they are
child?
brought to see the suffering child. And most of them return to the community of which they were a part, aware of
Based.
this, shaped by
Based.
this, but willing
Based.
to tolerate it.
Based.
A smaller number of them, upon seeing this, leave the society
Okay, let me open the
altogether.
door.
Now, the question that I want you to think about, in light of your answer a few minutes ago about what is demanded by morality, is some things that seem to have the structure of the Omelas story. I take it that at some point in the last 18 years or so, someone has let you in on the secret that the pleasure that comes from eating meat depends, as does the joy of Omelas, upon the suffering of a large number of non-human animals. I take it that you noticed last week and the week before, when the snow was falling on Yale's campus and the routes were made clear for you to get to classes, that the possibility of you walking across campus depended upon a large number of people whose lives are already difficult, getting up very early in the morning and doing back-breaking
Shoveling snow,
shoveling
yeah,
work
shoveling snow.
in the ice cold. I trust that somebody has let you in on the secret that the clothes that you wear, and from which you take a certain amount of pleasure, are, in a great number of cases, produced as the result of something quite close to the Omelas story,
Yeah.
namely child labor.
Yeah.
Indeed,
Yeah.
I take it that most of you are aware that the structure of the modern world
And
bears a rather shocking similarity to the Omelas story.
and
The possibility of flourishing in the first world is in many ways a consequence of an inequitable structure with regard to the third world.
and
Now, almost all of you gave an answer that said this sort of structure is, at least schematically, morally acceptable.
yes.
And the question is, what is going on there? Le Guin, in her story, suggests that you, as college students, are
If
at
we have
exactly the
100%
age
agency,
where
yes.
the salience of this may affect
Yes,
you most
that's
profoundly.
what's
So she
the
writes,
conclusion.
after
That's
being
the
exposed
conclusion.
to these sorts of facts, she
Okay.
almost all of you gave an answer. Now, equitable structure with regard, a consequence of an inequitable structure with regard to the
Yes.
third world. Now, almost all of you.
This assumes that everyone has 100% agency on their own selves. Okay? Let's go.
Gave an answer that said, this
We do
sort of
not live in
structure
that
is,
world.
at least schematically, morally acceptable. And the question is, what is going on there? Le Guin, in her story, suggests that you, as college students, are at exactly the age where the salience of this may affect you most profoundly. So she writes, after being exposed to these sorts of facts, she says, often the young people go home in tears or in a tearless rage when they've seen the child on whose suffering the fate of their society depends, and face this terrible paradox. They may brood over it for weeks or years, but as time goes by, she says, they begin to realize that even if the child could be released, it would not get much good of its freedom, a little vague pleasure of warmth and food, no doubt, but little more. Now, one of the interesting things about literature, in contrast to philosophy, is that it leaves it to you to interpret what's going on.
Nice.
And the fundamental question, I think, of the Omelas story is whether this sentence, they begin to realize that even if the child could be released, it would not get much good of its freedom, a little vague pleasure of warmth and food, no doubt, but little more.
Yeah, but that is like immeasurable. That is like infinite more freedom than he currently has, right? From our point of view, it's like, yeah, little good, little bad. Sorry, his situation will only be a little better. But from his point of view, he has been suffering since forever. If he's free, well,
true, or whether it is the sort of rationalization that recognition of one's comfort brings with it. She goes on, perhaps explaining, perhaps protesting too much, to say the following: it's too degraded and imbecile to know any real joy.
oh, nice.
It has been afraid for too long ever to be free of fear. Its habits are too uncouth for it to respond to humane treatment. Indeed, think about arguments about bringing democracies to countries with no tradition of democracy. If it so long, it would probably be wretched without walls about it to protect it, and darkness for its eyes, its own excrement to sit in. Their tears at the bitter injustice dry when they begin to perceive the terrible justice of reality and to accept it. Now, I don't have an answer to which of the two readings that I've proposed is the right one to make.
Oh my God, what a pussy.
Is she contending there, or helping
Or
you
maybe
to recognize
like a good
there,
teacher.
that early feeling of rage
professor,
at the fact that your well-being depends upon the suffering of others
Uh-huh.
is, in fact, an immature response to an inevitable structure of inequity in the world? Or is she suggesting that in coming to think that way, you are letting go of your only chance for moral behavior? That it's at the moment when you are profoundly exposed to injustice and it hits you in the form of tears or rage, that you are in a position to bring that into your life.
Oh,
She suggests, regardless, that living your life with your eyes open to the fact that your well-being depends upon the suffering of others is
yes,
morally mandatory.
true.
It is their tears and anger, she continues, the trying of their generosity and the acceptance of their helplessness, which is perhaps the true source of the splendor of their lives. They know that they...
Even Aristotle said, virtue and vice. Do not be offensive. Be virtuous, be viceful. Do not be offensive. Do not be confused. Do not be dumb. I am trying not to be dumb. Just accept that you're evil, or try to be as good as possible.
They, like the child, are not free, that they live in a world of mutual interdependence. They know compassion. It is because of their awareness of suffering in the world, she writes, it is because of that child that they are so gentle with their children. They know that if the wretched one were not there, sniveling in the dark, if we were not provided with the resources that let the first world thrive as it does, the other one, the flute player, would make no joyful music. All of the things that we benefit from, the greatness of this university, wouldn't be here. No joyful music as the young riders line up for their beauty of the race in the sunlight in the first morning of summer. So I want to leave you with that as one of the many things which we can take from the Omelas story. and
Okay.
as an introduction to what really goes into making a claim like the one Mill does.
Okay.
And what we'll talk about next class in the context of Kant are some systematic critiques which are
Nice.
offered of the utilitarian framework from the writings of Bernard Williams, and
Let's
an
get to
alternative
those
which is offered
critiques,
in the writings
yo.
of Immanuel
Bernard
Kant.
Williams. Deontology.
Okay, so what I want to
Chapter
do today
30.
is to finish up the lecture that we were engaged with last week about
Nice.
utilitarianism, and then to move on to what is perhaps the most dead guy on Tuesday lecture of the semester. That is an explanation of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant.
This meme is
So,
getting
in order
old.
to make up for the
Coxeye
fact
on
that the second
Thursday,
part of the
this guy
lecture
on
is fairly
Tuesday.
dry, we'll have a couple of clicker questions in the first part of the lecture. Okay. So as you recall from our lecture last class, John Stuart Mill, in the selections from utilitarianism that we read, says two extraordinarily famous things that serve in some ways as the heart of the utilitarian view. The first thing that he says is that he articulates what's known as the greatest happiness principle. This is a principle that's supposed to tell you what
Altruism.
it is for an act to be morally right. And what Mill says
Utility,
is
happiness.
there's a proportionality between the rightness of the act and something that it produces.
It produces.
In particular, a proportionality between the rightness of the act and the amount of
Happiness,
happiness it produces,
utility,
regardless of how that
consequence.
happiness is distributed. In particular, he says actions are right
Easy.
in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. They're wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness.
So of happiness.
And the happiness with which
He
we're
doesn't say
concerned is not
sadness.
the
See?
agent-
He doesn't say sadness or anger. Reverse of happiness. Kinda, you know? And you sometimes I think these philosophers are not actually, people think that philosophers are like bad writers because what do you mean reverse of happiness? Nothing vague. Bullshit. No, language cannot define what they're thinking.
its own happiness, but the happiness of
The way they apply these concepts, sometimes the logic even transcends language, but the meaning of it is conveyed through that language, even though the language is broken. The logic is still there. It's like a magic trick. I don't even understand how they do it, but it's like it's always there.
all concerned. The second extraordinarily famous thing that he says in the opening passages of utilitarianism is that the motive with which an act is performed is irrelevant to the act's moral worth. He says,
Okay.
the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action. He who saves another creature from drowning does what is morally right, whether his motive be duty or the hope of being paid for it.
Yes.
So we might summarize what these principles say as saying that the first one tells us that what matters for the morality of an act is the aggregate amount of happiness that it produces.
Can we
And what we're
speed this up?
concerned with here are
I understand
aggregates,
this.
not individuals. We're interested in how much good is done overall.
Let's get to the studies
Not where
so
those
that I
pieces
can
of good might happen
get confused
to fall.
again.
And what the second principle tells us is that what the utilitarian, who is after all a consequentialist, is concerned
Yes.
with are consequences.
Consequences.
They're interested in the outcome of the act, not the process by which that outcome was achieved.
Nice.
So the first reading that we did for last class was a selection
Own
from
it.
Mill's
Own
utilitarianism,
it.
where he articulated these
Just
principles.
own it.
And it's important to recognize that these get something profoundly right about what we're thinking about, I think, when we try to articulate what lies behind our moral judgments. It does seem right that what we're interested in is what the world is like after a particular action is taken. And to the extent that we're interested in what the world is like, our primary interest is not in how that state of affairs came about, but what that state of affairs is. And
Okay.
our primary concern, if we're taking a moral stance, is not in how much we ourselves have, but rather in how much good there is in the world
Okay,
overall.
people might struggle to
That
understand
said,
this
there
at
have been,
1.5.
since utilitarianism was
Let her
articulated,
talk at
a
1.25.
classic set of objections which are raised to the view.
Okay.
Some of which we'll talk more about
me.
today, and some of which we encountered in the selection from Bernard Williams that we read last class.
I read
Now,
nothing.
you will all recall that Williams' discussion begins with a story of a gentleman that he calls Jim, who
Who?
finds himself in a South American village that's run by a rather unsavory cowboy. And some of the citizens of that village have been protesting the unsavory cowboy's leadership. And so what the unsavory cowboy has done is he has rounded up 20 of those villagers.
Nice.
And he's planning, simply to show the others that he's in charge, to kill those 20 villagers.
Nice.
When Jim arrives, Pedro, the cowboy, tells him that if Jim is willing to shoot one of the villagers, the other 19 will be set free.
Shoot.
That's the Jim case. Jim shows up in a town.
Shoot.
The sheriff of the town has selected 20 people at random to be shot, but if Jim is willing to kill one of them, the other 19 will be set free.
The villager.
So, clickers out.
Shoot the villager.
Question, in the Jim case, what is
Shoot
Jim
the
morally
villager.
obliged to do?
Bro,
Is
you're
the moral
morally
thing for
obliged.
Jim to do
You
in-
know what you're morally obliged to do? You're morally obliged to shoot one villager, free all the other villagers, arm them, kill the cowboy.
In this case,
Just
shoot
do it. I don't care. Power through it. Brute force, you know. One guy just rounded up 20 people. So it must not be that. And it's a cowboy. He has a gun with 6 bullets, yo.
the one man, thereby
Oh, no,
liberating
He
the
has
other
a
19.
rifle. But the rifles don't have that many bullets, right? Back in those days, if a cowboy is there. So, yeah. Always shoot one guy, save the others, rebel.
Or is the right
20
thing
people are not even. Why are 20 people not rebelling? You kill the cowboy as
for
fast
him
as
to
possible.
do to refuse to shoot
Do not
the
give
one,
him these
thereby
chances.
letting all 20 die?
19. Yeah. Shoot one. I'm gonna get so mad at that.
So let's see how the numbers came out. So
23%.
almost 3/4 of you, actually more than
23%.
3/4 of you, think that what the morally right thing for Jim to do in this case is to shoot one man, thereby
Yes.
liberating the other 19.
Yes.
We'll have a chance next week to talk a lot
Unless
more about
he
these
gets
sorts of
unless the cowboy gets charged for genocide by the government for shooting 20 people or mass murder or whatever. Yeah, shoot that one guy.
questions. Our reading for Thursday is a series of moral dilemmas with this structure.
Okay.
But what I want to ask those 77% of you
Yeah,
who
but also
answered
that's-
yes to do now is to
Okay.
think about whether you take what Williams says is the natural utilitarian next step. Williams argues that if you are a committed utilitarian,
I'm not
and you
committed
think
to
that
anything.
the morally right thing for Jim to do
I'm not committed to
is
this
shoot
stream.
the
I
one
might get up and go.
release the other 19,
My internet is not coming
then you ought
back.
to
I didn't
feel
hear
moral-
anything.
that if you are a committed
Yeah,
utilitarian,
anything she said.
is the natural utilitarian
Okay,
next
let's go.
step. Williams argues that if you are a committed utilitarian and you think that the morally right thing for Jim to do is to shoot the one and release the other 19, then you ought to feel no moral compunction about doing so. There's a clear right thing to do. The right thing is to kill the one so as to save the 19.
I might be emotional,
You may
but there's
feel
no.
moral disapprobation. Indeed, you should feel moral disapprobation towards Pedro, who put Jim in this situation.
Yeah.
But you ought to feel no moral disapprobation towards Jim, and even more importantly, according to Williams, Jim himself ought to feel no moral compunction.
Okay. Do you think any hesitation he feels as mere squeamishness to think of any hesitations of
Among the
something
77%
morally
of
relevant?
you
Not
who
morally,
answered
emotionally relevant.
that Jim did the right thing in killing the one and saving the 19,
Emotionally
do
relevant.
you think that in shooting the one man, Jim ought
Unless
to think
your
of any
emotion is like
hesitation that
empathy,
he
and
feels
empathy
as
is
mere
like
squeamishness,
a
something that ought
equation
to be
in
overcome?
a variable in
Or
morality.
do you think that Jim ought to think of the hesitation that he feels
Do.
in doing what the utilitarian and what you yourself said was the right thing? Do you think he ought to think of his hesitation as being indicative of something morally relevant? So there's roughly 70
the
of you
bullet
who
again,
should be
two.
answering this. Let's see how the numbers come out?
No, sorry, one. I am default. That's right. One.
Okay. So most of you take on
Oh,
only
shit.
part of the consequentialist picture here, at least in the way that Williams understands it. Most of you think that, although the right thing for Jim to do in that case is to kill the 1 to save the 19, it's not the case that he ought wholeheartedly to
Morally relevant. How?
that as the right thing to do. In a minute, I'm going to present to you Williams' analogy.
Unless, okay. There are three ways you can be moral. You can be self-interested, you can be altruistic, you can go, it's a law of nature, just because. Moral because fuck you. Okay? 3 reasons. Okay? To think of any hesitation he feels is mere squeamishness. Okay? But self-interest, it doesn't. Self-interest, maybe emotions factor into self-interest. Altruism, it doesn't factor into altruism just because it's a self-interest only matters if you're emotional about it, I guess. Being moral is chill. If everyone is moral, everyone is chill, right? Okay. Yeah, squeamishness. I'm biting bullets.
Try to help
Let's
you
go.
see
I'm
why
biting bullets
someone
since
who
the last
really
lecture.
has taken on board the consequentialist outlook
Okay, she's
thinks
going to
that
give
the
me
combination of views which most
another
of you present,
hypothetical.
where you think the right thing to do is to kill the 1 to save the 19, but you
Yes.
also think the right thing to do is to feel bad about that in some way,
No, don't
have
feel bad.
not fully
Moron.
appreciated what the utilitarian stance provides you with as a way of understanding morality.
It
So
gives
Williams, as
you
you know,
like.
presents us with 2 cases. The first is the case I've just given you, the case of Jim and the captive Indians. The
Okay.
second is a case in high 70s fashion of a man who is
Nice.
needing to go back to work
Very
because
dramatic.
it's difficult
Yo.
to have his wife working outside of the home.
Okay.
I leave that to you as a period piece. But the work
Nice.
which George is provided in Williams' example is work in a bioweapons lab, something to which George feels moral opposition. But
Okay.
if George doesn't take the job in the bioweapons lab, a much more gung-ho person, somebody who's likely to advocate the use of bioweapons in all sorts of contexts, will get the job instead. So the 2 cases that Williams presents us with there have a common structure. And a
Okay.
common structure which we're going to see again and again
What is the
in
bioweapons
moral
show?
dilemmas. There's
What's the
one act that
bioweapons
the
shop?
person
I
can
don't
do,
know about.
that leads to a particular outcome, and another
Yeah.
act that the person can do that leads to a different outcome, where
Yes.
the first act is worse on its surface than the second. So
Yes.
Jim has the possibility of shooting 1 person or shooting no people. Those are the choices that Jim faces. If Jim does the first act, shooting 1 person, then 19 people will go free. If Jim does
Become
the
a
second act,
murderer.
which is not
Bite
to
the
shoot
bullet,
anybody
Jim.
at all, to
Or
refuse
sorry,
Pedro's
shoot the
bargain,
bullet, Jim.
then all 20
Sorry,
people
shoot the
will
gun,
be
Jim.
shot. Likewise, George faces a choice between doing one thing, taking the job in...
Take the job.
George faces the choice between taking the job in the biolab and not taking the job in the biolab. If
Take the
George
job.
takes the job in the biolab, then the gung-ho biological weapons fellow won't get the job. And the
Nice.
outcome will be better. If George doesn't take the job, then the gung-ho biological weapons
Plus
person
federal
won't
job.
get the job,
Plus-
and the outcome will be better.
Plus
So, in both cases, we have an act,
lower people dying
killing the
because
one
of
versus killing none,
bioweapons.
taking the
Good.
job versus not taking the job, which is worse
You know,
than another. But
easy.
the outcomes of those acts are inverted. The consequentialist tells us not to look at the act side of the equation, but to look at the outcome side of the equation.
Yes.
The only thing, says the consequentialist, that we need to take into consideration is how many people are saved or
Yes.
how much bioweapons research is done.
Yes.
According to the consequentialist, what we do is we look and we see outcome 1 is better than outcome 2. And
Okay.
then reading back from that, we decide which thing we ought to
My
do.
God, Pops.
We ought to do act 1 because it's the thing that produces the better outcome. The deontologist or virtue ethicist says not so fast.
Okay.
Don't jump
Cock
straight to the
blocker.
consequence. Look also at what it is that is needed to be done by the individual to bring about
Yeah.
that consequence.
How does
And
the act
recognizing that
change
act 1 is worse than
yourself
act 2.
and the outcome?
The deontologist or virtue ethicist says it's at least important to take seriously as a possibility that the right thing to do in this situation is the second act,
Yes,
even
always
if the
consider that.
outcome that it leads to is
Worse. Yes.
Now, what Williams points out is that if one takes seriously the first of these stances, the one where what we're looking at is the outcome and not the process
I
which
am
gave
not a
rise to that
utilitarian,
outcome.
right? Because in the previous study, I was like, yeah, don't gatekeep morality. Everything is moral. I mean, I bit all the bullets. Then I was categorized as a hardcore utilitarianist because I was like, yeah, he shouldn't feel bad because of that, right? Or maybe I'm just misunderstanding morality, you know? Yeah, he shouldn't feel bad, right? So I'm much more of a consequentialist than a utilitarian. No, I'm not a consequentialist. Or am I? Am I? No, I'm not. I'm a utilitarianist, I guess. Yeah.
Then any hesitation we feel towards bringing about that outcome as the result of the particular act is due to what we might call a certain kind of squeamishness. The utilitarian says, and we started with the quotes from Mill for this reason, that thinking about who does an act is morally irrelevant, just as thinking about
True.
who gets the goods is morally irrelevant.
True.
What matters,
No,
says the greatest happiness
not really.
principle, is how much aggregate happiness
That's too
is
simplistic.
produced. What matters not, except insofar as it affects the amount of happiness,
This is
who
kindergarten
produces that
philosophy.
happiness or where that happiness
What
goes.
is this?
So there is room on the
Mill
consequentialist
wrote
picture
extensively on this, right? So there's no way this is his philosophy is this reductive. There's no way. He's like a foundation, more like a utilitarianism foundation or whatever. Sorry, founder of utilitarianism or whatever. Yeah. I'll just
second
spit it
order
out.
thinking about distributions of happiness.
Okay.
If gross inequities in the amount of happiness across a society produces
Oh my
itself
God,
less
Boxer.
happiness, then we can take that into consideration in our calculus. If performing a particular kind of act produces in an individual less happiness, we can take that into consideration in our calculus. But ultimately, the only things that go into the equation in determining whether an act is morally right is the amount of happiness and not where that happiness is distributed. Now, as Epictetus pointed out, some things are up to us and some things are not up to us. And when Jim arrives in Pedro's village, one of the things that is not up to him is the fact that he faces a forced choice of the structure that Pedro has presented him with. It goes without saying that what Pedro has done is outrageous, but the structure of the situation that Jim confronts is a very simple one. Either Pedro will kill 20 people, or Jim will kill one person, and the other 19 will not die. That's what's there for Jim to be deciding on. Nonetheless, 75% of the 75% of you who thought that Jim did the right thing in that situation think that Jim ought to feel some squeamishness about carrying out that act. What Williams points out is that if one takes seriously the
It's not morally
consequentialist nature-
reprehensible. It's just an emotional, backlash. Sorry, a recoil for killing that. Maybe emotionality is like morality. Yeah. I'm just being stupid.
then perhaps the morally right thing to do is to try to cultivate in oneself moral sentiments that accord with one's moral judgments. If through rational argumentation and reflection, you come to realize of yourself that although you are committed to racial equality, although you are committed to gender equality, although you are committed
This
to
might just
equality,
get me a copyright, but I have something very interesting. There was I can remember this one scene from Fate Zero. Okay, we'll look at this at the end of the stream, yeah, or at the end of this segment because I am like, if I get copyright claim, I get copyright claim. I don't care. Let's. I don't know. Is it there? Is it there? Where is my search history here? Okay. Was it? Kiritsugu Saber. That ideology scene, they were like, okay, so weebs are really good. Weebs have everything. Okay, no. This is it. This is the English version, right? I'm not watching subs of Fate Zero. Fate Zero, so Fate Zero is really good. Don't. Ah, okay, this is like really good. Let me.
A knight cannot save the world. Knights call certain methods of fighting good and others evil, acting
Okay,
as if there were some sacred nobility to the battlefield.
okay, this is like bad audio. Oh, give me good audio. This is. Oh no. This is bad video. Ideology. Let's go. Find me a video. Okay, if I watch a reaction to a reaction, it'll. But these are probably weebs, so they will watch subs. I do not want subs. Can I find something? Something here, something here, nothing. Oh god, I haven't watched Heaven's Fields, yo. It's supposed to be really good. Kiritsugo versus Saber. Nice. Okay. Okay, enough stalling. Enough stalling. I can fix her. What? Disgusting. No, stop. No, these are weeps.
栄光だの名誉だのそんなものを危機としてもてはやす殺人者には
I am. What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do with this? Get rid of this.
Such illusions create
Okay, I don't care.
cannot save
Fuck it.
the world. Knights call certain methods of fighting good and others evil, acting as if there were some sacred nobility to the battlefield. Such illusions created by heroes throughout history have led countless young men to their bloody deaths, all for the sake of this glory and honor they all extol.
They are not illusions. Even the taking of a life in battle, as an act of a human being, must have ideals. Otherwise, every war would bring the very fires of hell to this world.
And there you go. You heard her, Irie. Our heroic spirit over there considers a battlefield to be better than hell. What a joke. A battlefield is hell itself. There's no hope to be had on one. There is nothing but unspeakable despair. Just a soulless crime we call victory, paid for by the pain of the defeated. But
A
humanity
consequentialist
never recognized this truth.
versus an
The reason is
idealist.
that in every era, a dazzling hero has blinded the people with their legends and kept them from seeing the evil of bloodshed they bring. True human nature has not advanced a step beyond the Stone Age.
That hit
Tell
hard.
me this, Kiritsugu. Do you force Saber to endure such humiliation because of your hatred for the heroic spirits?
Of course not. Personal feelings don't enter into it. I will win the Holy Grail and save the world. And I will wage that war with the most appropriate weapons I have at my disposal.
Okay.
Justice and righteousness cannot save the world. I care nothing for such things.
Kiritsugu, don't you understand? If you do evil to stop evil, that rage and hatred will give rise to new conflict. Kiritsugu Emiya, I do not know what betrayed you, or what has caused you to lose all hope. But your sorrow and rage are found only in those who at one time sought for justice. Kiritsugu,
Okay, this is
your
not
true
important.
self
This is just
wished to
anime.
be a
We should.
hero, did it not?
I'll just.
A hero to save the world. You believed in that. You desired it more than life. Am I wrong?
He's gonna look back with that gaze. Oh my god, anime! Ah,
Break
my
this
god.
endless cycle. The Grail.
Goodbye. Okay, where was it? The last Kiritsu. Kiritsu. Holy. Yeah, he gets there. This is not it, is it? Sigma Veil Crisis. No, not this. These are just spoilers. Yes. Kiritsu. This was amazing. This is kind of weird. What language is this? Oh my god. No. This. Let's just find me. Where is it? You cannot find these things, bro. You know.
6 billion people.
Okay. That problem, that hypothetical. Come on. Give me that hypothetical. The boat hypothetical. Come on. The boat hypothetical. Give it to me. Kills. Iris. Ilya and Iris. Born to suffer. Ilya and Iris' death. Okay, I'm just gonna. Okay. This is just Ilya dying. This is the wall that these are from the earlier. Okay, this is like no. Where am I? This is yeah. This is just Fate or Unlimited Blade works. Okay. Watch that fairy anime Prisma Ilia or whatever. That's that. There's a happy. There's a happy ending with the original route, right? Okay. Anyway, where was I? Where where am I going? Holy grail, come on. Holy grail. Why create skill destroy psychic? Okay. There must be some kind of a Kevin here. Please help me, my fellow weep. No?
In order for me to analyze
No?
what happened to our empire,
No? Haunting past? This is just. Yeah. A tragic ending. This is just.
キリツグの名のもとに
Okay, this is just the ending. Where he destroys the grave. Spoiler alert. Rip. This is him fighting. There are no scenes, yo. What the hell? What the hell? There are no scenes. They took it all down. It's all gone. It's no longer here. Abstract topics. Um, 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 there are none, are there? Okay. Let's see. This guy.
ない。己のため
Come
では
on,
なく
help me.
人のための。
Episodes
No.
I've ever seen till this. Kitsugu
No.
indirectly kills both Kenneth and his wife in
Yeah,
cold blood
spoiler.
after they had relinquished their participation. Episodes
Yes.
I've ever seen conflict would rain hell upon the tales
Yes.
of heroism in the past, no matter how inspiring, glorified, or romanticized they are.
Yeah.
Humans are too selfish to abide by cruelty.
Yes.
Kiritsugu's
Yes.
jaded demeanor speculates.
Oh my god, this fanboy. He's sawing out so hard. Just give me the
Who saw that
philosophy.
potential in him when no one
Yeah,
that
he
would
killed
forever
her.
haunt and cause him great pain. However, which inadvertently caused the whole village's destruction. This is the start of his utilitarian ideology, one that would forever haunt and cause him great pain.
Okay.
However, I also think of some sense of justice. You'd have to kill every evil person and die. It's a gut-wrenching and emotional. Accepts all the terrible things he's done. Someone to tell him that everything he did throughout his life was the right thing to do. Shirley, Natalia, Irisfield, and even Maya were
Okay.
pillars of support he needed
Okay,
to
this
convince
is-
himself
this is
that
gonna
all
hit.
the actions he took were
This is gonna
for
hit.
the greater good. Thus, we
Yeah,
reach
yeah,
the
yeah.
most climactic moment in Fate Zero, where Kiritsugu rejects the Grail after everything he's been through. He learns that the Grail is tainted, as it can only grant wishes via methods only the wisher knows. The Grail's only solution it offers for Kiritsugu's wish for humanity's salvation is to kill every person in the world and have him live out his life with his wife and daughter peacefully for all eternity. This comes
Do you know why? He leaves out the most important thing for this melodramatic character bullshit. Yo, there was a condition being imposed on Kiritsugu. Somebody find
as
me
an absolute
that.
bar from sacrificing
Who
the
am I
people he
talking to?
loved. Wish for humanity's salvation is to kill every person in the world and have him live out his life with his wife and daughter
Please,
peacefully for all
somebody,
eternity.
please
This
summarize
comes as an
that.
absolute shock for Kiritsugu, as the only way the Grail can save everyone is to kill everyone. Kiritsugu refuses the Grail as he didn't come this far from sacrificing the people he loved. By giving up the opportunity to live peacefully with his wife and daughter, Kiritsugu
Okay.
denies the Grail. Fuyu
He's just. Oh, why? Why are there no good? No good. Okay, let's say evil. This guy? This guy? This guy? This guy? Come on, help me.
Okay,
Help me,
hello,
bro.
hello. This is an emergency.
No. This guy is gonna. No.
His wife. As he readies to make his wish, he realizes that the Grail itself now has a will. The Holy Grail, as it turns out, has been corrupted to warp whatever wish comes to it to facilitate death and destruction.
Give me the hypothetical. Come on,
And it
come
is
on, bro. I
delighted
believe in you.
at Kiritsugu's wish, because it
I
lends
believe in
itself
you.
so perfectly to death and destruction already.
Oh, nice.
Kiritsugu is confused, but before he can even take in the situation, he is forcefully taken to a scenario you'll be familiar with. There
Now
are two
comes
boats
the
on
hypothetical.
The ocean. In one boat,
Finally.
300 people. In another, 200 people. Holes have sprung up in both boats simultaneously, and you can only repair one vessel. People are going to die. What will you do? Naturally, Kiritsugu chooses the 300. The 200 are outraged. They come to him and demand he fix their boat first, and involuntarily, Kiritsugu himself guns down the 200 people personally for intending the lesser evil.
Now. Okay. Now.
The premises
Another.
of consequentialism require that you don't have control over the situations themselves.
Yes.
It only dictates how you respond to them. Your actions
Yes.
are predictable, calculable responses to variables.
Yes.
But others can calculate your response too, and given anything is allowed as long as it's the lesser evil, that makes your actions very, very easy to manipulate based on those variables.
Yo, guy,
Without
don't
hard
preach.
rules
Don't
on
be
what
an
you
idiot,
refuse to
bro.
do, you become a
Just
flexible tool,
pose the
as long as
hypothetical.
the circumstances demand that you live worse. If they want your vote, they just need to make the alternative be worse. Set up the
Okay.
situation to force you to outcomes to ensure the best case scenarios. But in effect, it cedes all responsibility to the systems itself in determining what it is allowed to do. Consequentialist logic gets even more wild when you get into power structures.
This guy
If your
is going to.
actions are merely the output of your assessment of the present
This guy is
variables
talking
with
to.
no moral boundaries, then you can be compelled to any action by anyone who has power.
Okay, I'm being uncharitable. This guy's explanation is really, really, really important to morons. But please,
Over those
can I just get the hypothetical, the entire
Logically
hypothetical,
optimal behavior can
please?
still be the vessel of your own self-destruction if we
Yes,
continue to
yes. The agency, I mean, the hypothetical is always posed by an external force. You are just an actor that is reacting to it. Yes.
its logic. There's a reason it's a common phrase.
And every action you will take has already been determined by someone who's sufficiently smart because you are a utilitarian or a consequentialist or whatever. Okay,
Among people who enable evil to say they had no other
bro,
choice, or they were just following orders. Consequentialism itself demands. You did it. You saved the most people. 300 people were saved. With the original boat damaged, they decide to continue their boat journey on 2 different boats.
Okay,
Now
we get it.
200 people are on one boat, and 100 people are on the other.
Yes.
Again, 2 leaks spring up, and you can only save 1 boat.
Thank you, Zach the Raccoon,
Again,
whoever you
kill
are.
100 people automatically. You started with 500 people, and you have personally killed 300 as the lesser evil. Kiritsugu is baffled. How could this be the lesser evil if more people died than were saved? Kiritsugu, again, you kill 100 people who decide to continue their boat journey on 2 different boats. Now, 200 people are on one boat, and 100 people are on the other. Again, you kill 100 people automatically.
See?
You started with 500 people, and you have personally killed 300
people. Yeah.
Kiritsugu is baffled. How could this
Do you know what's the problem with this though? If the 300 people invade the 200 people boat, let's say Kiritsugu chooses the alternative. And is like, yeah, since you're posing me this bullshit hypothetical, so I'll just go with the lower amount of people. If he like chooses the lower amount of people, the 300 people might just invade. There's no because if 200 people would invade a boat of 300 people, why wouldn't the opposite be possible? So they'll just invade. And then you have to kill either the 200 or the 300 again. And the split is going to happen again. And this hypothetical is going to be posed again. And basically, you're fucked. Even if you chose to save the lower amount of people by slaughtering 300 people, the 200 people are again going to split up. And again, you will be forced to kill one group.
If more people died than
And at the end,
were saved.
you will be an idiot. You'll be the only guy alive, I guess.
But the Grail explains that while it has overwhelming power, it needs an algorithm to enact someone's wish, and only knows how to follow the procedures the Wishmaker themselves does. The 200 remaining split off into 2 boats, and again you kill. Split off into 2 boats, and again you kill. Split off into 2 boats, and again I think a lot of people see this situation and interpret it to just be saying, well, what if you have to keep doing trolley problems? But I don't think that's quite right. I think the more compelling point shown here is about how consequentialism only works if, well, you actually know and control the consequences of a situation. Kiritsugu has no way to know future boats were going to spring leaks. He has no way to know if the people he's saving are going to be imperiled, and the people he just personally massacred would have found a way to survive if not for him murdering them. Utilitarianism only works in the world of extremely constrictive thought experiments for a reason. If you start making the variables even a smidge more complicated, it's apparent success
Oh my god, I'm muted.
breaks down, and
Look
the
at
people
this.
he's saving are going to be imperiled, and the people going to know problems. But I don't think that's quite right. I think the more compelling point shown here is about how consequentialism only works if, well, you actually know and control the consequences of a situation. Kiritsugu has no way to know future boats were going to spring leaks. He has no way to know if the people he's saving are going to be imperiled, and the people he just personally massacred would have found a way to survive, if not...
Exactly. You have no control. And even if you chose the contrarian option and be like, yeah, I'm just going to save this 200 people, the hypothetical and the event that the hypothetical proposed and the event that will follow that hypothetical, should you choose either one, is getting you fucked. So essentially, the consequence is the same, but you cannot see it.
them.
And so you never know. So how do you know about consequences in the real world?
Only works.
But then, how do you not know?
In the world of
it's a fucking
extremely constricted thought.
It's a fucking mess, bro.
If you start making
I'm supposed to learn something. I was supposed to learn something new.
The entire appeal of utilitarianism is that it takes responsibility for the consequences of your actions, and that you won't doom society because you're taking a principled stand. But the question becomes, what happens when what you thought was the best action isn't? And how will you know? There's a difference between the foreseen, the foreseeable,
Okay, this guy is going to go full philosophy. Check this out, Zag the Raccoon, utilitarianism, and Kiritsugu. Should you pick the lesser of the two evils? No, I mean, the fact Geralt has this one thing. Geralt. Witcher 3. Evil. That quote is the unironically the answer. Unironically. Check this out. Okay, where is it? The Nilf card, yeah, okay, whatever.
Not choose at all.
Okay.
Tougher than yours, that's certain. Evil is evil. Lesser, greater, middling, makes no difference.
Can't fit me! Bring her down. Do it my way. You like that, you bitch? Get the hammer. Kick her teeth in.
The degree is arbitrary. The definition's blurred. If I'm to choose between one evil and another, I'd rather not choose at all.
Yeah, I don't need to see him fight. I know. Okay. It's kinda good that Geralt is like, yeah, I am not choosing. Yeah, he's forced to choose, but still, his logic is correct. You never know if you're choosing. How do I say this? Even if you chose the lesser evil, you do not know the consequences that will arise from it. Or if you chose the greater evil, the consequences are totally out of your control. You are already categorizing them as evil, as malicious to you, and to maybe the things you care about. So, to give them the power and to have agency in giving them even some amount of power is like a lose-lose. Does that make sense? Have I been stun locked for half an hour?
Regardless of gender identification,
Sorry.
You're committed to not being ageist, you're committed to not being discriminatory on the basis of physical disability. You might, as a result of having been lived in a society largely structured in ways that encode a kind of residual racism and sexism and homophobia, you might find in yourself certain sentiments that lead you instantaneously to respond in ways that run contrary to what your moral commitments tell you you ought to do.
Oh, back to learning.
I take it you think that there's some moral mandate upon you to try to get rid of those instinctive responses. If you're really committed to anti-racism, then you want, to the extent possible, to have a harmonious soul when engaging in interracial encounters. If your reason tells you that you're committed to anti-racism, you want your spirit and appetite to be in line in that way. So there are instances where morality on reflection tells us that something is right, and the consequence of that for our behavior towards ourselves is that we ought to try to cultivate in ourselves instincts that correspond to that. Williams says, the utilitarian should say, that in cases like the Jim case, Jim is like the residual racist. He knows what the right thing to do is, but he has a residual tendency to be pulled in the morally wrong direction.
Ooh.
If you don't think that it's true that Jim ought to change his attitudes in that case, and you do think that the residual implicit racist ought to try to change her attitudes, it would be useful to try to think about what pulls those two cases apart. Okay, so that's what I want to say in closing about the utilitarianism and its critics. And we'll return, as I said, to those issues twice more. Once on Thursday when we read Judy Thompson's trolley problem paper, and once next Tuesday when we look at some empirical work on that question, which suggests a naturalistic explanation for why it is that Jim feels the hesitation that he does. What I want to do now is to introduce you to the third of the main moral outlooks that we're going to consider this semester. So last lecture, we looked very carefully at
deontology,
moral theories in the form of John Stuart Mill. And those are theories which locate the moral value of an act in its consequences. In the first part of the class, we spent a lot of time looking at Aristotle's virtue theory, which located the moral worth of an act in the actor. Remember, we looked at acts having moral worth only if they are done as the result of
I'm going to speed through this and rewatch this next stream.
What we're going to look at today is the third piece of this story.
Because I need to get links for this, you know.
An action is not the result of what the actor is like. It's not the result of what the consequences are like. Rather, it is about the act itself. In particular, we're going to look at the deontological theory of Immanuel Kant.
Yes.
So, Immanuel Kant
let's go.
was an 18th century German philosopher who, like Plato and Aristotle, provided a comprehensive and systematic philosophical theory that to this day is taken seriously as one of the ways one might make sense of the world as a whole. Kant has theories of metaphysics, that is what kind of stuff there is. He has theories of epistemology, that is how we know about what kind of stuff there is. He has theories of ethics, what the right thing to do is.
Kant was supposed to be an old guy, right?
Aesthetic value. Famously, Kant articulated
during the French Revolution.
Domains of philosophy in three
He's supposed to be really old.
books. The first, The Critique of Pure Reason, which told you about what the world is like and how we know it to be that way, which he wrote first in 1781 and then revised. The second, The Critique of Practical Reason, which is an account of the nature of morality. And the third, The Critique of Judgment, which is an account of the nature of aesthetic value. But in addition to those dense works, Kant also wrote what he took to be more popular presentations of his view. In the case of metaphysics, he wrote a book called The Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. And in the case of ethics, he wrote something that he calls The Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, which is, of course, the work from which we read excerpts for today. So I give you this context because I want you to know that as hard as the reading that we did from Kant was, I chose for you perhaps the easiest part of the easiest book that he wrote.
Dude, Kant is supposed to be the hardest philosophers, you know?
If you take home nothing
it's like supposed to be really confusing.
Nothing else from our reading of Kant. I want you to take home Kant's idea of the categorical imperative. And my goal in the remainder of lecture today is to bring you, by reading through with you the text of Kant that we had today, to a point where you will be well positioned to understand what Kant means by the categorical imperative. Depending on how the next 20 minutes go, we'll get to that either right at the end of today's lecture or right at the beginning of Thursdays. Of Thursdays. Okay, so Kant's text, groundwork or grounding for the metaphysics of morals, begins with a very famous passage where Kant says nothing can be regarded as good without qualification except the good will. This claim should be familiar to you, O readers of Book 2 of Plato's Republic. This is the classic distinction between things that have intrinsic value and things that are merely of instrumental worth. And indeed, much in the way that Plato's Socrates does, Kant goes on to enumerate some things which fall into the other category, the category of things that are of mere instrumental utility. Among the things that cannot be regarded as good without qualification, says Kant, are talents of the mind, like intelligence and wit, qualities of temperament, like courage and perseverance, gifts of fortune, like power and riches and honor and health. And, he says, taking a direct jibe at Aristotle and noting as such that he is so doing, neither can the ancient virtues, of, how do I close that email? Neither can the ancient virtues of moderation and self-control be considered as good in themselves. Why?
Okay.
Because though being intelligent or brave or rich or controlled will help you to achieve the goals that you have, they don't determine what those goals might be. They magnify your effectiveness as an agent, but they don't determine the valence, the value of your agency. So says Kant, a witty, persevering, rich, healthy, moderate...
Wait. Did Kant just say what I was
They
saying?
magnify your effectiveness, what those goals might be. They magnify your effectiveness, what the or rich or can be considered of moderation and self-control be considered as good in themselves. Why? Because though being intelligent or brave or rich or controlled will help you to achieve the goals that you have, they don't determine what those goals might be. They magnify your effectiveness as an agent, but they don't determine the valence, the value of your agency.
Okay,
So
he's
says
not
Kant,
saying what I'm
a
saying.
witty, persevering, rich, healthy, moderate thief will be an outstanding thief, but that doesn't make his thiefdom good.
Okay.
Each of the virtues that has traditionally been extolled as a virtue, says Kant, gains its value only insofar as the goodwill is part of it.
Yes.
Now, a goodwill, says Kant, is good not because of what it affects or accomplishes. It's good in itself. When I say that Kant is a critic of consequentialism, I am not exaggerating. Kant doesn't think that the outcome of the act is what matters. And in an extraordinarily famous passage, famous in part because of the rather shocking translation which has come down to us of it, Kant says, the goodwill would remain good even if, by the niggardly provision of stepmotherly nature, it wholly lacked the power to accomplish its purpose. By which he means, even if you with your goodwill were frustrated in all of the goals that you set out to achieve, your actions would still have moral worth, and somewhat more poetically and a bit less, vocabulary that is challenging to the modern ear, Kant says, even if it didn't achieve its outcomes, it would, like a jewel, still shine by its own light as something which has full value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitlessness can neither augment nor diminish its value. Now the question is this, how could anybody come to have this view? How could anybody have a view of morality that says what matters for an act to be moral is not the outcome that it produces, but rather the description under which the act is done? What I want to try to do right now is to put you inside the Kantian picture so that you get a sense of what that worldview looks like. So in the passages that we read for today, Kant makes three particular claims. He says that an action must be done from duty in order to have moral worth. So the first notion that I want to try to explicate for you is the Kantian notion of something being done from duty. An action done from duty, says Kant in his second proposition, has its moral worth
Why
not
these
in the
people
purpose that is to be
have
attained by it, but in the maxim
this
according to which
one
the action
thing,
is
divine
determined.
concept, yo,
So
Logos,
the way that an action done from duty
deal
has
with
moral
it.
worth is
Bro.
not by looking to see what outcome you're expecting from it, but rather by looking to see under what characterization did you perform the act. And again, I'll spell out what each of those terms mean. Finally, says Kant, duty, which lies at the heart of deontological moral theory, duty is the necessity of an action done out of the respect for the law. Kant believes that it is only when you subject your will to a law which you have made for yourself, that is, the moral law, whose binding force upon you have recognized, it is only in that circumstance that you are truly free. So Kant says duty is the necessity of an action done out of the respect for the law, and when you perform an action out of respect for the moral law, says Kant, then and only then do you act autonomously. Okay, so three incredibly complicated, subtle claims from Kant. Let's try getting to the bottom of what they mean. So let's start with the first claim, the claim that an act has moral worth only when it is done from duty. So Kant points out that there's three kinds of motivation that we might have in performing an act. We might do an act out of duty, we might do it out of inclination, or we might do it out of self-interest. Only cases of the first kind, in fact, only pure cases of the first kind, have moral worth. Actions that are done merely in keeping with, but not from moral duty, have no moral worth, according to Kant. So if you obey the law, but you do so only out of self-interest, your obedience, says Kant, has no moral worth. If you rescue the drowning child from the pond, but you do so only because there's a sign on the tree that says rescue drowning children, $1 million reward, your act has no moral worth.
There's a causation
so we can think about what
thing
Kant's
here,
claim amounts to and how it differs from the other ones that we've been looking at by thinking of the question space in terms of a flowchart. So we're trying to decide whether a particular action has moral worth. And the first thing we want to ask ourselves is, does the action accord with duty? If the answer to that is no, that is if you've done something like lied or stolen something or murdered somebody or allowed something terrible to happen in front of you that you could have easily at no cost to yourself prevented, all of the authors that we've read, unsurprisingly, say that the act has no moral worth. Oh, so did that just disappear? That was supposed to be in red on black. Is it completely invisible from the back? Oh, that's good. Okay, so what that says in red is no lying and stealing, but it's in red. I can't change it in the middle of the slides.
No
but,
lying or
I'll
stealing.
remind you what those things say. Okay, the second question that we ask, having eliminated now from the realm of morally worthy acts those that don't accord with duty,
nice graphics,
is what
bro.
motive the act was done with. So perhaps you act in a morally worthy way, out of self-interest, without immediate inclination. So you pay your taxes because if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to have to pay more taxes. You obey the speed limit, but only because you're afraid you might get caught. Otherwise, Mill says those acts have moral worth. Kant says, no, they don't. And again, that's supposed to be in red, but it's now invisible. Suppose that you do an act in such a way that you have an inclination that's in keeping with duty. So Kant thinks you have a duty not to commit suicide, and he considers the case where you fail to commit suicide because you're happy. Kant thinks you need to be loyal to your life partner, but he says there's no moral worth to remaining loyal to your life partner while you are in love. There's no moral worth, says Kant, to acting kindly towards somebody when you feel sympathy towards them. Because in those cases, though your act is in keeping with what morality demands, it's not done because it is the right thing to do. You are doing it because your inclination happens to line up with what morality demands of you. Now, Aristotle, of course, took this situation to be the one in which moral worth is paradigmatically expressed.
Okay,
But Kant thinks that in such
let us. Yes, but what is the motive? From inclination in keeping with duty.
cases, you cannot tell that an act was done from the moral law. All you can see is that it was done in keeping with the moral law. It corresponds to what the moral law demands. But we can't see from that the motive was
good.
It's only in the third case, the case where you act from duty without any inclination and without any self-interest, that Kant thinks the moral worth of an action can be seen. If you preserve your life when you feel the inclination to do otherwise, if you act kindly in situations where there's no reward for you and you feel no sympathy, in those cases, says Kant, we can see that the act was done not merely in keeping with, but from the moral law. This isn't to say that Kant doesn't think a life lived in the way that Aristotle suggested life is lived is a badly lived life. Cases where your inclination happens to line up with
how does he fundamentally
from act from of course, you can act in such cases, you cannot tell that an act was done from the moral law, but more demands the right to basically Kant part side duty that worth Kant because you're going to have to pay more taxes. You obey the speed limit, but only because you're afraid you might get caught. Otherwise, Mill says those acts have moral worth. Kant says no, they don't. And again, that's supposed to be in red, it's now invisible. Suppose that you do an act in such a way that you have an inclination that's in keeping with duty. So Kant thinks you have a duty not to commit suicide, and he considers the case where you fail to commit suicide because you're happy. Kant thinks you need to be loyal to your life partner, but he says there's no moral worth to remaining loyal to your life partner while you are in love. There's no moral worth, says Kant, to acting kindly towards somebody when you feel sympathy towards them.
Yeah.
Because in those cases,
Kant is
though
all
your act
vibes,
is in
isn't
keeping
he?
with what morality demands, it's not done because it is the right thing to do. You are doing it because your inclination happens to line up with what morality demands of you. Now, Aristotle, of course, took this situation to be the one in which moral worth is paradigmatically expressed. But Kant thinks that in such cases, you cannot tell that an act was done from the moral law. All you can see is that it was done in keeping with the moral law. It corresponds to what the moral law demands. But we can't see from that the motive was duty. It's only in the third case, the case where you act from duty without any inclination and without any self-interest. From the act was done, the case where you act only that the motive was case and without any it's from that the motive was duty. You can't see from that the motive was duty and without any self-interest that Kant thinks the moral worth of an action can be seen. If you preserve your life when you feel the inclination to do otherwise, if you act kindly in situations where there's no reward for you and you feel no sympathy, in those cases, says Kant, we can see that the act was done not merely in keeping with, but from the moral law. This isn't to say that Kant doesn't think a life lived in the way that Aristotle suggested life is a badly lived life. Cases where your inclination happens to line up with duty helpfully keep you out of this box of doing the wrong thing. But they don't allow you to test your character and see of yourself that the motivation that you have for doing the right thing is to conform to what the moral law demands of you. So with that understanding of what it is to act from duty in mind, we're now in a position to make sense of Kant's second claim in our reading for today. That an action done from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose that's to be attained by it, but in the maxim according to which the action is determined. So remember, we've learned that an action done from duty is one that you do in conformity with what morality demands, because that is what morality demands. Not because it's in your self-interest, not because you are inclined to behave in that way, but because that act is what morality demands of you. But in order to determine whether an act is what morality demands of you,
is some kind of a divine
needs to be
concept.
described in a particular way to you. And the way that you describe that act to yourself makes use of what Kant calls a maxim, a subjective principle of volition, that is, a description of something that is about you, the subject, that says what your desires towards behavior are in that situation. A subjective principle of volition, that is, a description under which the act is done. So it takes the form, perhaps, in all engagings with all who come into my shop, I will provide them with an honest accounting of how much their transaction is worth, regardless of whether I could be discovered cheating in this. Or in all of my encounters with those who are weak and in need of my help, I will provide them with the aid that I can, regardless of whether that will be of benefit to me. Only by considering the motive, and not by considering the outcome, can the action be expressive of the goodwill itself. The goodwill is the only thing that is good in itself, says Kant. And it's only by looking at the description under which an act is done that we can determine whether the goodwill was implicated in the right way in the choice to perform.
So good is like something mental for Kant. Good manifests, reflects in physical things for all of these people, I guess. Or maybe it's good is also like a construct for them, but okay. Let me see if I can get While for Socrates, good is like this ethereal concept that can manifest or reflect in reality in some impure form. Kant is saying goodwill is totally divorced from reality. And the actions that we do are like copies in a separate dimension that look like good. And hence, it's just a correlation. Goodwill, he's saying that the mental is like something totally distinct, right? Or is he? I'm just stupid. Why am I rambling? Yo, just go.
Duty
Just
is
finish
the necessity
this.
of an action done out of the respect
And
for the law.
deal with this
So we know that an
tomorrow.
act has moral worth only if it's done from duty. We know that in order to be done from duty, it needs to be done under a certain description. And now we're told what it is that this duty amounts to. In order for an act to have been done from duty, says Kant, it must have been done with explicit recognition that what one is doing at that point is respecting the moral law insofar as it articulates what morality demands of you. Not insofar as it articulates ways that you might have a well-ordered, harmonious, happy soul.
Okay.
Not insofar as it articulates ways in which lots of happiness could be spread around to lots of people. Out of respect, rather, says Kant, for the fact that it is what morality demands of you. The moral worth of an act, says Kant, does not lie in its effect. For the effect could have come about in multiple ways. I can set out to release a biological gas in a subway that's intended to kill thousands of people, and because I'm not very good at chemistry, the result could be that I produce an enormous amount of joy in those thousands of people. The effect can come about in lots of ways. Kant says Mill would
It's
have to
not
say
a
that in releasing that
mental,
gas, I have
it's
done
something
much
in
worse.
another
Kant
dimension.
says,
It's like
no. What matters is the description under which the act is done, and in particular that description be that one have respect for the law itself. So, I told you I was going to get you to the point of the categorical imperative.
I don't
I'm gonna end
understand,
lecture today
Kant.
by bringing you right up to that point, and then
I'm
next class we'll
stupid.
talk about it in more detail. So the question is this, right? This is a pressing, exciting question in Kant. All right, I realize that we're in the in Kant part of things, but this is really exciting. What sort of law, says Kant, he even puts a but to get you sort of excited, but he says, cliffhanger, what sort of law can that be, the thought of which must determine the will without reference to any expected effect, so that the will can be called absolutely good without qualification? It's so exciting. We're finding something that's going to make us genuinely autonomous and free and moral. Well, remember, it can't be anything particular. It can't be anything specific about the world or its outcomes. What can it be? It can be the will's universal conformity of its actions to law as such. That is, what makes the law binding is the fact that it is recognized by all rational agents as binding. In particular, it takes the form of what Kant calls the categorical imperative. And here's the formulation of the categorical imperative that we got in our reading for today. Never act except in such a way that I can also will that my act maxim should become a universal law. Never do anything that you couldn't will everybody else to do at the same time.
What the fuck is he talking
We'll begin next
about?
lecture with the example that Kant uses
What the fuck is he talking about?
Talk a little bit more about various formulations of the categorical imperative, and then move to
Okay, I don't give a fuck. Give me the full picture, yo.
imperative.
Shut
the formulation
up.
of the categorical imperative that we got in our reading for today. Never act except in such a way that I can also will that my act maxim should become a universal law.
Never act except in such a way that I can also will my act maxim should what become a universal law. That I can also will that my act maxim so become a universal law. I gave up, bro.
Never
Fuck
do
this.
anything that you couldn't
Fuck this.
will everybody
Fuck
else to
philosophy.
do
I
at
hate-
the same time.
I hate
And we'll
everything.
begin next lecture with
I
the
hate my
example
life.
that Kant uses to
I
illustrate
hate
this, namely the
everything.
lying promise. Talk a little bit
Just
more
get
about
me
various
out.
formulations of the categorical imperative,
Get
and then
me
move
out.
to Judy Thompson's trolley problem paper.
Bye, YouTube. Bye. Tomorrow we'll do the trolley problem. Today, no, not the trolley problem. We'll have to do this again because I do not know what the fuck she's talking about. I do not know what the fuck is Kant is talking about. Okay, Kant was supposed to be hard to understand, but I did not know he was being more fucking obtuse than someone who lived 3,000 years ago. You know? Even the people who preserved like the Islamic revolutions, the golden Islamic age whatever scholars who like rediscovered or translated into Persian the Greek books of Aristotle and Plato and shit, they lived before Kant did. So why is Kant twisting words in worse ways? Maybe he's just German. No, Germans can be like totally blunt, so uneasy. Maybe he's just, yeah, who knows? I'll pass my judgments. I'll see. I'll deal with this tomorrow. Screw this. Bye, YouTube, and of course, everything is in my notes. You can just take it, copy the entire thing, download it, whatever. Okay, peace out. Bye bye.